sinned, and sin brought what? Death. Yeah, every time. Wages of sin is death. That was the first major player of the book. The second major player of the book of Genesis, Noah. And from Noah we learn what? Judgment. It is appointed a man to die once, and then comes judgment. What happened with Noah? Oh, I thought you were going to say magic. Right. Oh, yeah, the flood. Right? God flooded the whole earth. So all those men who were in sin, God was sorry that he made them, and he destroyed them all by water. The Bible promises he'll never do that again. That's what the rainbow really means. But he is reserving this world for judgment of fire. God will burn it all with fire. So you see the first two major players. Adam teaches us sin and death. Noah teaches us judgment. Then we get the third major player in the book, who was Quincy. You remember? Oh, come on, think about it. I'm not letting you off think that easy. You got it over there, Grayson?
Moses.
Nope, not Moses. Abraham, that away. And what do we learn from Abraham? Anybody remember? Melody, you remember? Abraham teaches us what? No. Taylor? Salvation. Abraham teaches us salvation. How was Abraham saved? By grace through faith. That's right. It wasn't works. It wasn't anything like that. God took a pagan idol worshiper, and a barren man at that, and God chose to save him. And we see how God was gracious to Abraham, because Abraham tried to blow it in multiple ways at multiple times, but God won't let him go. And ultimately, in Genesis 15, Abraham believes God, and God credits righteousness to Abraham. So the righteousness God demands from you, God will give to you if you give him faith. That's the gospel. So Abraham teaches us salvation by grace through faith. We get a little bit on Isaac, and Isaac still sort of reinforces grace, but the next major player in the book of Genesis was Jacob. What do we learn about Jacob? What do we learn from Jacob? Anybody remember? The Cates boys were here by then. Yes. Okay, he was chosen, but that's not the major thing we learned. Sanctification, that's right. And you walk through Jacob's life, and it is the whole process of how God takes him from Jacob to Israel. That's right. And we see Jacob in his pride and his deception and his striving and all of the sort of worldliness and self-sufficiency that is Jacob. And one by one, God breaks him down, right? He deals with Laban, and that's a 20-year education about his own inadequacy. Ultimately, he wrestles with God, and God touches his hip. God broke him not only emotionally, not only spiritually, but God broke him physically. He limped. And that was all part of sanctification, to take this rough-hewn, worldly man and turn him into a man of God. That was the process of Jacob's life. And you see that at work in his life. It's what God does in our life. But we sort of wrapped up Jacob last week. And now we go to the next major player in the book of Genesis. The next patriarch. The big one. And I asked you last week, who is it? But I told you it's not one person. Who did I tell you it's not? It's not Joseph. And that's strange, because Genesis 37 through 50, that's who everybody thinks it is. Tell me, what do you know about Joseph, somebody? And it can be right. What do you know about Joseph, Grayson? He was one of Jacob's sons. Something else we know about Joseph. And if you've ever had the Bible story of Joseph, yes, sir, Coda? He was the favorite, like Ian, right? No. Well, your mom only ever talks about Ian. He was the favorite. Do you remember anything else about this right here? Coat of many colors. Yeah, that's the one everybody loves, right? When your grandma knits you a rainbow sweater, right? His brothers sell him into slavery.
They threw him in the pit.
That's right. They throw him in the pit, and then they sell him into slavery. Should have called on you first. My bad. Right? When he went to slavery, where did he go to slavery? Egypt. All right. What happens while he's in Egypt? Anybody remember the next thing that happens in his life? Right here, Aaron. It's like, okay, he does. That's not next, but he does. He interprets dreams. Yes, sir.
He gets wrongfully accused.
Wrongfully accused by who? Not Pharaoh's wife, but sounds the same. Potiphar's wife. Yeah. He's bought by a man named Potiphar, and his wife tries to kind of have an affair with Joseph, and he is above reproach. He won't do it. So she falsely accuses him, and he gets thrown in prison. And while he's in prison, he gets the chance to interpret some dreams. And what else do you know about Joseph? He ends up finding favor with Pharaoh. How? Predicting the famine. And he comes up with the plan to save Egypt from famine. And what else do you know about Joseph? Wait, oh, he's the right-hand man? Yes, sir?
He eventually sees his brothers and forgives them.
All right, he eventually sees his brothers and forgives them. So y'all just summarized what the final books or the final chapters of the book of Genesis is about. And everybody thinks when they read Genesis, clearly Joseph is the next major player. Clearly he's the next one that Moses wants to highlight. Now there's no doubt there's a lot of information about Joseph in here. But Joseph is not the next major player. He is not the next patriarch. He is not the next main focal point. And I promised you, what, 5,000? Is that what I promised last week? Was it 50?
Yeah, it's a lot of points.
All right, 50,000 Bible points. And by the way, Hannah, who watches on live stream, texted me as soon as it was over, and she got it right. I've already awarded her points, but they won't take them at the college that she goes to. So, anybody want to tell me who the next major player of the book of Genesis is? Is it? I'm asking you to tell me, not have you ask me. Zach says Judah. Is it God? Jesus. Yeah. Benjamin. Abigail says Benjamin. Are you going to say Judah or Reuben? No, you got to pick one. Samuel. Well, that's a Bible name. That's good. So we're a few hundred years ahead of your time there. All right, the next major player is Judah. This will explain to you, by the way, if you've ever read through the book of Genesis, and by the way, tonight, instead of covering a specific text, I'm going to give you an overview of the final 13 chapters of Genesis so you'll understand what's going on. Because most people want to take the Joseph story and they want to say, poor old Joseph, the favorite son of his dad, he was sold into slavery by his brothers who eventually forgave him. So they think the end of the book of Genesis is about forgiveness. Or they talk about the story of Joseph and how he was wrongfully accused by Potiphar's wife because he wouldn't sleep with her and he stayed above reproach, but he went to prison. And so they say the end of the book of Genesis is about making right moral decisions and being a stand-up guy. Or they talk about how Joseph, was in prison, eventually interpreted some dreams, and he gets elevated to the top, really the number 2 guy in Egypt. And they say the story of Joseph and the end story is about how God takes you, and if he puts you in bad circumstances, but you're really, really good, it'll all pay off, and you'll end up number 2 in command in the land of Egypt. And this is a story about endurance, about always doing what's right, no matter the bad circumstances. And so we're really prone to go through the end of Genesis, pick out the high points of the story of Joseph, which you've heard your whole life. You just evidenced. You've all told me the story of Joseph. And we try to apply it to some sort of practical way to live our lives. That is to totally miss the point of the book of Genesis. It's not what he's doing. Now, 37 through 50, I just asked you to tell me about Joseph, his story. Somebody in chapters 37 through 50, tell me about Judah. Something you know about Judah from chapters 37 through 50. Come on, Kate's clan. Y'all were like, me. No? No? Abigail?
Daughter.
What? You just said daughter. What am I supposed to do with that?
No, never.
You're trying to read ahead. You're like, I got to find something in here. Anybody got anything on Judah? See, this is the point. This is why nobody understands the end of the book of Genesis, not rightly, because you grew up your whole life and our parents told us the story of Joseph, but nobody told you the story of Judah. And by the way, Genesis 37 through 50 is Judah's story. It's not Joseph's story. Now, Joseph is a major player in the life of Judah, but it's Judah's story. Now, some people say, no. Judah cannot be the next major player. Judah is a terrible human being, and that's true. Let me show you a little bit about Judah. Turn over to Genesis 37, verse 25. Genesis 37, verse 25. Zach, read 25 to 27.
And they sat down to Edenville, and as they raised their eyes and looked, behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead, with their camels bearing aromatic aloes, all in myrrh, and on their way to bring them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, What profit is it for us to kill our brothers and cover up his blood? Come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh, and his brothers listen.
Whose idea was it to sell Joseph into slavery? Judah's. He is a bad guy. You look at Judah's sons. Look at Genesis 38. Look at verse 7. Genesis 38, verse 7. This is one of Judah's sons. Somebody read verse 7.
But Aaron, Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death.
All right, so he was wicked and God did what?
For his firstborn.
Yeah, God killed him. Then look at the other son, verse 10. Somebody read that one. This is the other son, by the way, Onan.
But what he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, so he took life.
All right, so son number 2 was also wicked before God, so God killed him too. Some kind of dad that raises sons that are so evil that God just kills them. And that's not even the best part about Judah. At the end of chapter 38, there's a story about Judah. It's found in verses 15 and 16, where Judah actually sleeps with the widow of his dead son. Now, in his defense, he did think she was a hooker. Okay? This is Judah. He's not a good guy. And people read this story about Genesis and they delightfully skip over the Judah parts. They read through the end of Genesis and they read all about the Joseph narrative because it seems like it's all tied up with a Hallmark ending. By the way, the Joseph narrative is not a Hallmark ending. People always say, yeah, but Joseph was number 2 in Egypt. That's true. He was. But Joseph was a slave in Egypt until the day that he died. Even as number 2, he's always subject to Pharaoh, and Joseph never comes home. He's sold in slavery probably around the age of 12 to 14, and he never comes home. It's not this, see, it all worked out in the end, Hallmark ending, he gets the girl, let's have a Merry Christmas. That's not what it is. But people skip over the Judah stories. They read the end of Genesis, and it's awkward. What am I supposed to do with this story of God killing his sons? What am I supposed to do with this story of Judah sleeping with his daughter-in-law? And then, what do we do with that? That's integral to what Moses is teaching you. But people say you can't pick Judah. Judah can't be the next patriarch. But what have we learned about God's election? He's sovereign. And does he choose people based on their merit and their worth? Not yet, he hasn't. He chooses people that shouldn't be chosen. I mean, we talked about him choosing Abraham. He's barren, right? Or he's old. He's got a barren wife. He's a pagan worshiper. He's a slave trader. Not the kind of guy you want to pick to build a nation around. We get to his sons. Who was Abraham's firstborn son? Ishmael. And God wouldn't give the inheritance to Ishmael. Instead, he chose who? Isaac. Why? Because he wanted to. And then you get Jacob and Esau. Who's the real man of the bunch? Esau. Yeah, he's the mighty hunter, right? I mean, he's the bearded wonder. He's the guy that's going to go out in the wilderness and kill game and eat it. He's going to shop at Bass Pro Shop. I mean, he's the guy that you can fish with and hunt with and golf with. But Jacob, he's watching the cooking channel, right? He's not the kind of guy you want to hang out with. And I apologize to any of you guys that like to watch the cooking channel. So it doesn't necessarily mean anything. But you get the point. Esau's the man's man, and he's the oldest, but God chooses who? Because Jacob was so righteous? No, he was a liar, he was a deceiver, he was a manipulator. God doesn't choose men based on their merit. There's actually a word for this if you study what we call Calvinism. It's called unconditional election. That God chooses men because he desires to choose them, not because they're worthy to be chosen. It's called grace. God chooses by grace. So here we are with Judah. The end of Genesis is about Judah. Genesis 37, I'm just going to give you a quick rundown here. Genesis 37 is about Judah's jealousy. He's jealous of Joseph. He concocts the plan to sell him into Egypt. Chapter 38 will be about Judah's immorality. It's going to be about when he goes and sleeps with his daughter-in-law because he thinks she's a hooker. Genesis 38:26 will be Judah's salvation. Does anybody know the story of Judah's salvation? So I'm going to give you a quick recap. This is a sneak peek, like you're watching a movie and you get to see a preview of one that's coming. So he goes and sleeps with his daughter-in-law because her husband's died, and he thinks she's a prostitute. He promises her a goat in payment, which he does not have. So he gives his ring, and a signet ring, and some other stuff to her. Is like a down payment, but I promise I'll send the goat back to you if you'll let me come to you. And so that all goes down. After he goes into her, she goes back into her regular clothes, and they try to take the goat to pay the prostitute, and it's a really awkward scene because you have a guy on Judah's behalf going into a city, pulling a goat, saying, yeah, I'm looking for a prostitute. And they're like, we don't have a prostitute. He said, well, I've got this goat here. It's not my goat. It's not for me. It was for a friend's prostitute. I'm trying to pay him. I mean, it's an awkward, weird story. When they find out later that his daughter-in-law, her name is Tamar, is pregnant, Judah says, does anybody know what Judah says when he finds out his daughter-in-law is pregnant? You got to kill her. She's been immoral. I say we kill her. And she says, no problem, but you need to know I'm pregnant by the man who owns this seal, this ring. And it's kind of like, oh, that's awkward, right? And Judah makes the statement, and all of a sudden his eyes open. He says, she is more righteous than I. And you get Judah in repentance before God. And God even restores Judah's sons to him, not by raising them from the dead, but he immediately gives him 2 more sons through Tamar, twins, and they actually become part of the Messianic line. But you get the salvation of Judah. By the way, Judah is the 4th born son. Reuben disqualified himself because he slept with Jacob's wife. You remember that story? Simeon and Levi disqualified themselves because they went to that city that raped Dinah and they killed all those men and stole all the women and children. And so Judah's next in line when you see Judah get saved. In chapter 45, you get Judah's deliverance. Judah goes before Joseph. Joseph is actually pretty vengeful in the story. He's actually laid a trap that he can get Benjamin in prison. He's already got Simeon. He's trying to get Benjamin. And the reason is because he's trying to make Jacob pour wrath upon his sons for losing now his other son that he loves, Benjamin. And Jacob sets a trap and he has him. But Judah offers himself in the place of Benjamin. It's a self-sacrificing place, and Judah begins to rise to power as this next family leader. He does all the speaking and talking, and you begin to see it. And finally, you see Judah's preeminence. And I want you to see this. Turn to chapter 49. Chapter 49. This is the end when Jacob, Israel, is prophesying over his sons. And when you look at this, you'll notice in verses 3 and 4, he talks about Reuben. And he talks about how Reuben is preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power, but he went up and defiled his father's bed, and so you shall not have preeminence in verse 4. Now, Reuben, you're the oldest, but you don't get to be the next. Simeon and Levi were numbers 2 and 3 in the pecking order, but they had swords of violence. And so Jacob says in verse 6, let my soul not enter into their counsel, let not my glory be united with their assembly, because in their anger they slew men, and in their self-will they lamed oxen. And so they're not going to get to be the next patriarchs. But then we get to Judah. Verse 8, Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down to you. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He couches, he lies down as a lion, and as a lion who dares rouse him up. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh comes. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. You see that? He makes Judah the ruler of all. He puts Judah ahead of everybody. Now, turn to the book of Matthew real quick. We're going to come right back to Genesis, but turn to the book of Matthew. And look at Matthew chapter 1. And somebody read the first 3 verses of Matthew chapter 1.
Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah was the first of Perez and Zerah, and Tamar. Perez was the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram.
All right, and if you follow it all the way down to verse 16, you get to Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, by whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. Matthew chapter 1 gives you the genealogy of Jesus. And whose line does Jesus come through? Judah. Judah through Perez, by Tamar even. God redeems what was sinful and wicked. Judah is the next patriarch. Through Judah comes the next king, comes the Messiah. So here's what Genesis 37 through 50 is about. It is the story of God saving Judah. Because when God saves Judah, through Judah will come Jesus, who will save us all. That's what the point of the end of the book of Genesis is about. And so you get this first major point that you're going to see throughout. I want you to know this as we go. You're going to get a lot of facts about Joseph, but everything God is doing is for the benefit of saving Judah. Okay? Because through Judah comes Jesus. Now there's a second thing that you're going to see as we walk our way through the end of this story. And that is that you're going to see a villain approach, an enemy, a foe, the bad guy in the story. Now, if you think the story is about Joseph, who's the clear-cut and obvious bad guy in the story? Judah, the brothers, right? Who throw him in a well, they're going to kill him, then they sell him. They're the villains. But we just said the point of the story is not to kill Judah. The point of the story is to save Judah and to save his brothers. They're not the villain. Does anybody know what the villain is in Genesis 37 through 50?
Sin.
What?
Sin.
It is sin. In what form? That's the question. How does it show up? And by the way, that's the perfect answer. Sin is correct. Do what? No, I mean, it's there. It's the same enemy you see over and over, especially in the Old Testament. It seems to rear its head all the time. What? Nope. Nope. Not a particular sin. It's the way this sin shows up. And the answer is famine. Famine is the enemy. What is it that nearly kills Jacob and his sons? It's famine. That's what drives them into Egypt. It is famine that actually allows Joseph to rise to power. It is famine that actually allows Egypt to become the breadbasket of the world. It is famine that ultimately drives Jacob and his sons into Egypt. Famine is the foe. Famine is the enemy. Now, I have a question for you. Why is famine the picture of sin in the book of Genesis? Somebody know? You got to think all the way back to the beginning. All right, it is God's judgment. That's true. There's lots of ways God could judge. But famine was specific. When Adam sinned, what did God say when he cursed Adam? You remember? Cursed is the ground because of you. It's no longer going to yield food to you. By the sweat of your brow and by the work of your hands, right? You're going to have to work hard to get food out of the ground. It's going to naturally yield thorns and thistles. Famine was always the easiest reminder that sin has come upon us. That sin is here. That was always the easiest picture because every time man had to go to work the ground, it was a reminder again that this is sin. It still is, by the way. It's just not very often recognized by people. Famine is the picture of the ground which God cursed. When you walk outside of this church, if you walk across that lot to my house, in particular if you're wearing flip-flops, you will have flip-flops full of goat heads by the time you get there. I did not plant them. My kids did not plant them. I'm pretty sure the last preacher didn't plant them. And regardless of how many times we try to get rid of them, they are there. Those and those other kind of weird waxy leaf things, which I really hate. But they're all stickers, and they stick in there. But you know what you'll never get when you walk across that lot? You know what you'll never get on your shoes? Squash, watermelon, strawberries, corn. It doesn't naturally grow. If I'm going to get that, I have to till the ground, I have to plant it, I have to water it, I have to take care of it, I have to harvest it, right? Not goat heads. They just survive on their own, right? They grow weeds and thorns and thistles. That's exactly right. It's always a reminder of the curse. And famine will be the enemy in this story. It already has been. Remember, it was famine that drove Abram out of Canaan into Egypt to begin with. It was famine that took Isaac and made him run to Abimelech. So famine is the enemy. Now the question is, if famine is the problem, why didn't God just fix it? I mean, why didn't God just send rain on the land of Canaan? Why didn't God just cause their crops to grow? If that's the problem, why didn't God just fix the famine? But there's something surprising about this famine. Look at chapter 41 of Genesis, verse 28. Chapter 41, verse 28. Somebody read that verse.
It is as I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he wants.
All right? This is the dream that Pharaoh had. Remember, he saw 7 fat cows, and then he saw 7 skinny cows, and the 7 skinny cows ate the 7 fat cows. And he asked Joseph, what does that mean? And Joseph's answer is, God has shown you what? No. Look at the verse. What does it say specifically in verse 28? What he is about to do. Who sent the famine? God did. It's from God. And you say, well, why would God send a famine if he's just going to have to turn around and deliver his people from it? That doesn't make sense. God sends a famine to remind his people they are sinful. And in their sin, they are called to cry out to him for salvation. God still does that in your life, by the way. God still brings upon us struggles and trials and hardships. God still allows us at times to swim in the consequences of our sin so that we will taste the bitterness of it and see how badly we need salvation. That's why sometimes when you do stupid things, bad things happen to you. It's just a common consequence of sinful behavior. And sometimes God lets you swim in it. Sometimes God lets you feel the sting of it. Not always, and not always to the full effect, but He will. He'll let you feel the consequences. And you say, well, why wouldn't He just deliver me from it and not let me feel it? Because He wants you to run to Him for salvation. And you're going to see, through the end of Genesis, you have Judah who is chosen and famine which tries to kill him. It's what it's out to do. And God has to intervene. And there's one more thing then that you learn from Judah. As I said, from Adam you get sin, from Noah you get judgment, from Abraham you get salvation, and from Judah we get something. It's a word, or Jacob you get sanctification. Then from Judah we get a word that you may not be familiar with, and it's the word providence. Does anybody know what providence is? Okay, God taking care of His people. That'd be a good, like, provision, giving them provision. That can be true. But God's providence is much more than that. Anybody know what providence is? Like a kingdom, like a sovereign reign. His providence is very much that. It's God setting in control and controlling providentially all things. We talk sometimes about God's miraculous intervention, where God may just reach in and part a Red Sea, or where God may make the sun go backwards 3 steps, or God may make the water of the Sea of Galilee like that, which He can walk upon. I mean, that would be a law that breaks the laws of nature, where God does something supernatural, actually miraculous. And people ooh and ah over all of that. And they are amazing anytime God steps through in the Bible and works a miracle. But far more impressive to me is God's providence. Now, providence would say, the opposite of it in our world would be chaos. That everything is random. Everything is chaotic. That God just basically started the globe spinning and He walks away and He's waiting to see how it all pans out. And today you will get up and you'll make a decision, and based on your decision, you'll set off a train of dominoes falling. So if you go out the door and you turn to the right, it will set this whole set of circumstances in play because you went to the right. But had you gone to the left, perhaps it would have set a whole different thing of circumstances in play, right? You ever contemplate that sort of reality? It's like these alternate endings, that if I drop a ball and it rolls there, what might it do? Or if it rolls there, what might it do, right? And people talk about chaos and everything's chance and everything's just, free will and given to whatever. That's sort of the idea. Providence says that God allows you in your own finite mind to step out that door and decide right or left. God allows you to go and sort of set your dominoes in motion as you will, and yet guess who's in charge of it all? And at the end of the day, men did exactly what they wanted to do, sometimes even sinful things, but at the end of the day, guess what happened? Exactly what God ordains. Exactly what He intended. He is sovereign and in control of all things, and it is mind-blowing. How can God control like that all things when men do what they want to do? And sometimes it's sinful. That's what you're going to see at the end of the book of Genesis. It's the providence of God. God will show up and do amazing things even through sinful choices, and God will cause to happen exactly what He wants to happen. So let me tell you about the providential plan of God in the end of Genesis. Step number 1 of God's providential plan is to send Joseph to Egypt. That's step number 1. Now, how does God get Joseph in Egypt? Buys him a plane ticket? How does God get Joseph in Egypt? Does anybody know the catalyst to that? Jealousy. What happens? Oh, yeah, because Dad buys him that stupid coat, right? He makes him that coat of many colors, and he's clearly the favorite, and so they get jealous and they hate him. But that's not the only thing that happens that makes them have enough of Joseph. There's something else that happens. He has a dream. What's he see in that dream? Oh, yeah, all his brothers are going to bow down to him. And, you already didn't like him very much, right? And now he has this dream that we're all going to bow down to you? Yeah, I don't think so. And because of that, they're so filled with jealousy, guess what they do? They sell Joseph to Egypt. It's a sin, it's wrong, but it's exactly what they wanted to do, and it ends up being the exact thing God intended to take place. When Joseph gets to prison, the next plan of God is to get Joseph arrested. That's the plan. How does God get Joseph arrested? Do what? Yeah, he's falsely accused. I barely heard you. Yeah, he's falsely accused. He goes to be the slave of this guy named Potiphar. His wife thinks he's a hunk of burning love. He won't have anything to do with her. And so she falsely accuses him. They throw him in prison. And you've got to be thinking, what in the world? This can't be the plan of God. Why would I be stuck in prison? But that's plan number 2, get him thrown into prison. Why does God want him in prison? What do you think there, Phillips?
So he can say what all those guys' dreams meant that he gives.
Who's going to end up in that prison? 2 guys. Nah. Okay, yeah, the cupbearer. Is that what you were saying?
In the ship.
Chef, okay. What? Yeah, the baker and the cupbearer. And they're going to show up in prison. So Joseph needs to be in prison because that's where he's going to encounter them. And they're going to have dreams and Joseph's going to interpret them. And so the next plan after getting him in Egypt is get him in prison. After he's in prison, we've got to get him noticed. How do we get him noticed? The dreams, right?
The ship tells Pharaoh.
That's right. He tells Pharaoh, hey, I know this guy who can interpret a dream. After that, the next plan is to get him promoted. How does Joseph get promoted? Phillips is on a roll here. Somebody else. Right here. Right here. The one who always tells me he doesn't know nothing. Come on, Caleb.
He tells the Pharaoh what's going on with his dream, and he's right about it.
That's exactly right. He's right about the famine. And so he saves Egypt. So he gets promoted to number 2. And the final plan then is to use Joseph to deliver Jacob. How does he do that?
By predicting that the famine was going to happen.
He does predict the famine
And so his brothers didn't come to get food and he
because he stores up food and they come. Why was God wanting him there? Why did God want Jacob in Israel? Why did God want, why not just, like we said, send him food? Why is God trying to get Jacob into Israel? All our life we've been talking about, go to the promised land. Go to the land of Canaan. Stay in Canaan. Don't go leaving. Don't go marry the locals here. It's all been Canaan, Canaan, Canaan. When Abram tried to leave, God sort of just picked him up and placed him right back. And now God's trying to get Joseph into Egypt, or Jacob into Egypt. Why? We found out a little snippet the other day. Whenever Simeon and Levi went to that city that raped Dinah, remember, and they killed all the men and they stole the women and right that. Do you remember Jacob's answer when they did that? You brought trouble upon me. And when everybody else around here hears what you've done, they will come and attack us, wipe us out. How many people were Jacob at this time? How big was his family? You might know. When they all go into Egypt in a few years, there's 70 of them total. They're not very big. They don't have that many people, and they live in the middle of a land that's not theirs, and now they've offended everybody. How easy is it going to be for Jacob and them to subdue the whole land? It's not going to happen. Beyond that, turn back to Genesis chapter 15. Genesis chapter 15. And I want you to see a promise that God made to Abraham. A promise and an explanation. Genesis 15. And look at verses 12 to 15. This is, by the way, Abraham gets saved in verse 6. And then we get down to verse 12 through 15. Somebody read that.
Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abraham, and he awoke terror and great darkness fell upon him. God said to Abraham, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. Where they will be enslaved and furnished for 100 years. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterwards they will come out with many possessions. As for you, you shall go into your fathers in peace. You will be buried at the ocean.
And verse 16, I'm sorry.
Then in the fourth generation they will return here for the
All right, so on the day God saved Abraham, what did he tell him was going to happen to his descendants? What did he tell him in verse 13 is going to happen?
They will be enslaved and oppressed for 420 years.
Yeah, they're going to be enslaved for 400 years. You're going to die, you're going to be buried in peace. But in the fourth generation, they're coming back. And why does he say they're going and staying away for 400 years in verse 16? The iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. When they come back, Moses leads them back to the border. Moses dies and Joshua leads them in. What's the command of God when they go into the promised land? Kill them, right? Kill them. If it's alive, kill it. If it'll burn, burn it. If not, bring it to me. And they go in, and there have been many people who claim God to be unfair or unjust because God has ordered basically the execution of all these peoples in the land of Canaan. God tells Joshua to go in and to kill them and eradicate the land of the pagans. And they say, well, that's just not fair. God was just cruel and mean. He couldn't go in there and kill all those people. Based on Genesis 15, what do we know about God? How long did he wait before he judged the Amorites?
Till Jacob died.
Well over 400 years. I'm not going to let you kill the Amorites now. Their iniquity is not yet complete. But in over 400 years, they will have sinned so much and failed to repent that their judgment will be just. So what you have now going on in Jacob's life are a couple of things. One is the Canaanites have not yet warranted the judgment of God. They will at some point, but not yet. Jacob and his family is not yet big enough to subdue that land anyway. They're too small. They're only 70 in number. And so God's plan to patiently wait for the Canaanites to fulfill their iniquity and to multiply Jacob to a point where they can subdue the land. What is God's plan for all of that? Send them to Egypt. Egypt will be the incubator. Egypt will be where God will fulfill the promise he made to Abraham that your descendants will be like the sand of the seashore, that they'll be like the stars of the heavens. And God will do that through 400 years in Egypt. It's all part of the providential plan. The plan which he has said from the beginning, the plan which he had for Abraham. And now you have Moses preaching to his people saying, do you see? Everything about what has happened has been the intention of God. God is the one that sent us there. God used Egypt to multiply us. God is the one that's bringing us out. God is sending us to judge the Amorite and the rest of the Canaanites that live in this land. But it's all the providential hand of God, that God is reaching in and saving, multiplying and saving his people. Egypt is where he'll do that. And then they'll all come out. What you get then at the end of Genesis 37 through 50 is not a nice, neat little story about don't be jealous of your brother, or don't slip into sexual immorality, or just be a faithful person and in the end it'll work out. That's not what the end of Genesis is about. That's just what we would call low-hanging fruit. That's just picking the easy stuff. What you find at the end of Genesis is the story of God's providence, how he will save the people through whom will come the Messiah who will save us all. He is saving Judah because through Judah comes Jesus. And you see then this providential hand of God in control of all things. Turn over to Jeremiah 29:11. It's a verse that gets quoted a lot, but it'll make a lot of sense here. Jeremiah 29:11. It's past Psalms, past Isaiah. If you get to Ezekiel, you went too far. Jeremiah 29:11. And I know you've heard this verse. Somebody read it if you got it.
I know the plans I have for you, plans for welfare and not for harm, to give you a future.
I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans for welfare and not for calamity, to give you a future and a hope. Everything that you're going to see by the end of the book of Genesis is all by God's design. He's doing it. Now, put yourself momentarily in the shoes of Joseph. Here you are, your father's favorite. I kind of think he was a little bit snotty. It's kind of like when Zeke and Zach would fight, and Zach was notorious for just pushing your button right to the very end and holding needling on it, and then finally, like after Melody, right? After 3 or 4 days or weeks of button pushing, finally Zeke would just well off and whack and hurt Zach. And he'd come in crying, And Zeke would come following, and we'd say, what happened? And Zach would say, Zeke just hit me for no reason at all. You know, I mean, not counting the last month where you had button after button after button, right? Joseph was kind of that way. I mean, what kind of guy flaunts his new multicolored coat and then tells his brothers about the dream he had where you're all going to bow down to me? You get it? He's kind of that way. But Joseph here, other than that, a pretty good guy. And then gets sold into slavery. That's pretty bad. You know, and while he's a slave, he makes lemonade out of his lemons, and he's going to become the best slave you can possibly be. And his master's household is blessed because of him. And then he gets falsely accused and thrown into prison. And while he's in prison, he again turns his lemons into lemonade. He's going to be the best little prisoner you ever saw, and the jail never ran more efficiently than when Joseph is there. And then he gets forgotten in prison. And then he goes up and he gets an opportunity to help Pharaoh out. He turns his lemons into lemonade again, and he interprets the dream. He becomes the number 2 guy in the kingdom, but he still can't leave. He's trapped there. And you'd have to wonder at some point in Joseph's life, here you are in the middle of this prison, and you've been sitting here for years, and you probably have to wonder, God, what are you doing? You ever run across things, and maybe you haven't yet, maybe you have, but maybe you haven't yet, but you certainly will in life, where you'll look at the circumstances of your life, and you'll say, I don't have a clue what you're doing. What are you doing? And people in humanity even has the statement that the Lord works, you know how to finish? You may know it? In mysterious ways, right? We don't know what he's doing. I, from my perspective, could not possibly see why I would be sold into slavery. I cannot possibly see the upside to being falsely accused and thrown in prison. I cannot possibly see the upside to being forgotten in prison and to just sort of rot here for a couple of years. I cannot see what you're possibly doing. It must feel forgotten by God, and it must feel like life is just caving in and nothing is coming of it at all. That must be how Joseph felt at times, and there will be times in your life when you will feel that way. And you will say, I can't see anything that God can be doing good. There can't be anything good that could possibly come from this. You get stories of tragedy and hardship and pain and suffering, and you say, there can't possibly be any good. I can't see what it would be. Trust me, Joseph could have been there. But you get to the end of the book of Genesis. Turn to Genesis chapter, let's go 45. First, Genesis 45. That's Jeremiah. I got to get Genesis. Genesis 45. I'm going to read in verse 4. Then Joseph said to his brothers, please come closer to me. And they came closer, and he said, I'm your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Now do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there's still 5 years in which there will neither be plowing nor harvesting. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Now therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his household and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall live in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children and your flocks and your herds and all that you have. There I will also provide for you, for there are still 5 years of famine to come, and you and your household and all that you have would be impoverished. Turn to chapter 50, the last chapter of the book of Genesis. And look at verse 18. This is after Jacob dies, and the brothers are afraid after Jacob dies that he'll turn on them. Genesis 50, verse 18. Then his brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. That's what we call providence right there. In order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. So I show you a story of Judah selling Joseph into slavery, and then I show you a story of Potiphar's wife lying about Jacob or Joseph and having him thrown into prison. And then I'll tell you a story about a cupbearer and a baker that totally forget Joseph, and he rots in prison for 2 more years. And I ask you, how did Joseph get to Egypt? And from a human perspective, how did he get there? Bad luck, right? Life just stinks. I don't deserve it. This isn't fair. That's what it looks like from a human perspective. But at the end of the story, and there are very few people in the Bible that get this explanation, Joseph is one that gets it. Not very many people get explained to them the reason for their suffering in this life. But Joseph did. And Joseph is told at the end of his life what? Why did I come to Egypt? Why did I get sold here? You didn't send me here. Who did? God did. Oh, you meant it for evil. But God was using it. God was sovereign. And in his providence, God sent me here. And sent me here to do what? Sent me here to do what? What? Yeah, provide. Preserve life for you. He sent me here to save you. Because through your salvation, Jesus will come. That's the providence of God. You're going to see that all throughout God's salvation of Judah, God's usage of Joseph. What men meant for evil, God means for good. And God is saving his people even through the acts of evil, wicked men. That's the perspective that Moses' people are going to have to adopt. That's the perspective that you and I are going to have to adopt. As we go through this world, you're going to face really bad things. It's part of living in a sin-infested world. It's part of living in a world where death is a reality, sickness is a reality, tragedies happen. Right now, Florida's getting hammered by a hurricane. Hawaii just got hit by a fire. I mean, we understand bad things happen. Those guys in Matador, how long did you live here before the tornado came through? A week? Some are going to assume you brought it with you, right? So live there a week and a tornado comes through, right? And Jayton, that same night, they had winds blowing roofs off of houses, right? Sometimes bad things happen and people wonder why. Sometimes people die. Sometimes they die young. Sometimes they die unexpectedly. And you say, why? That doesn't make sense. That's not fair. That can't be real. And what do we learn about the providence of God? That he's in charge of all of it. Just to make humans suffer? Why is he doing it? For the salvation of his people. He's always at work for the salvation of his people. And God uses even the most difficult, painful, hard, unexplainable tragedies for the salvation of his people. And I'm going to close with the ultimate story of this. He did it with Joseph, as you see. Allows all this bad, but God was really the one behind it all along. Turn to Acts chapter 2. This is the ultimate story of God taking sinful men who do sinful things and making it turn out for the salvation of his people. Acts chapter 2. And look at verse 22 through 24. Acts chapter 2, 22 through 24. Men of Israel, listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene, a man attested to you by God with miracles and wonders and signs which God performed through him in your midst, just as you know. This man, delivered over, are you ready? By the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God. Whose plan was it that Jesus would be executed? It was God's plan. But who did it?
The Jews did.
Yeah, the Jews, through the Romans, right? You nailed to a cross by the hands of godless men and put him to death. So wait, does that mean the Pharisees didn't want to kill Jesus? Oh, no, they wanted to. I mean the Romans didn't mean to kill him? No, they meant to. They wanted to. They did exactly what they wanted to do. They hated Jesus, they wanted him dead, and they killed him. But whose plan was it? Why was it God's plan to kill Jesus? To save us, to pay the penalty for our iniquity. In verse 24, God raised him up again, putting an end to the agony of death, since it was impossible for him to be held in its power. This is what you understand about the providence of God. He is always in control. And he is always at work for the salvation of his people. And you're going to see that at the end of the book of Genesis. This is going to explain to you why you're going to get such weird stories about Judah in there that you're like, this story doesn't make sense. Why even put it in here? because God is saving Judah. That's what he's doing. By his providential hand, he's saving Judah, because through Judah comes Jesus, who will save us all. Does that make sense? All right, we're going to see it next week. We'll start in this life of Judah. Any questions or comments? All right. It's a good crew tonight. So we'll start over here with Aaron. We'll popcorn prayer this thing around. Everybody remembers how that goes? All right.
Dear Lord, thank you for letting us be here. Thank you for letting us get the safe travels and
Thank you for letting us hear this message, Lord. Please let us apply it to our lives and tell it to dear Lord, I pray for humility, endurance, and dedication to reading your word and talking about it. God, I pray for Ed for them who could not make meals or away tonight. And I pray for my friends and parents and them. So may they come on food by meals.
I pray that you can grow my faith in you, that know that you're in control of all things, and that you're sovereign, and I would trust fully in you, Lord, and that when I be really encouraged, Lord, that you would.
Father, you are God, and we praise you and exalt you. And we are in awe of your providential hand, that you cause all things to work together for good to them that love you, who are called according to your purpose. And even when we can't see it, it makes perfect sense to you. And so, Lord God, we submit our lives to you, and we ask you to work in our midst, and we ask for the salvation of your people. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.